Okay, this is a lecture that we'll be using as an introduction to political theory lecture. I want to cover some basics. Um, so this is just simply titled An Introduction to Political Theory. So first, we want to ask the question, what is political theory, right? Um, our first or primary definition is simply this: the systematic construction of our arguments of what we ought to do. So political theory is concerned with the normative endeavor of determining what we as a society really should do. A simpler definition, one that I like quite a bit, is the construction of political statements. So it doesn't have to only be necessarily about what we ought to do. We can include some decent amount, actually quite a bit, of scientific practice in political theory. We'll look at some of that definitely through the semester. We'll be looking at that. Here for right now, we'll just see how evidence comes up in a few different key places. Another very interesting way of thinking about political theory, what is the relationship between the we and the I? What do I owe my society slash government slash fellow citizens? And what does the we owe me, right? So those two, that interplay between the we and the I. The classical definition from Greece, theoria, viewing the rituals of another city-state. So they would send ambassadors from Athens to Sparta or Corinth, different places. And as part of your job as an ambassador is you would actually watch and enjoy and participate sometimes in the religious ceremonies and rituals of that city. And then you would come back and report to your home city, this is what I saw, this is what they do, everything works like this and that. So that's actually just kind of like a cool one. And then we have, whoops, I want to go to that one. There we go. We also have a Straussian definition. So Leo Strauss is a very famous 20th century political theorist. He comes up in a lot of modern political theory. His definition is the debate and discussion of perennial questions and issues in the human condition with the goal of discovering truth. And I put capital T truth because he means it. He thinks there is some kind of truth out there and that human societies through all time have been sort of meditating and ruminating on these sort of perennial questions. And the goal of it is to enjoy the good life. And the good life, think of the good life here as kind of like a dinner party. You get together, you share food, you discuss and debate these perennial questions. And then, one of my other favorites is this Nietzschean definition, which Nietzsche is a 19th century, very, very, very important political theorist. I mean, he's up there with Plato. I mean, he's so important. And, to Nietzsche, though, it's more the play of ideas and a project of ethical self-cultivation. So kind of a project of self-discovery. Who am I? Playing with ideas, trying to sort of get a handle on what you individually really think. Now we have this one important distinction here, right? That's going to come up through everything. The distinction between is and ought. Is a scientific claim or an empirical or factual claim. Empirical just means factually based. So for example, I've been teaching for a long time. This one comes up. People need others in a lower social status to feel good about themselves, right? So maybe we're discussing equality, some kind of notion of equality. People say, well, boy, we really need people who are, less well off than us in order to feel good about ourselves. And that's a is or empirical claim about how identity works. And for this, we can use our scientific tools to test it and see how much does this claim really hold water. Undoubtedly, many people do act this way, many, but undoubtedly not all. So if we want to mobilize this as a claim in our argument, we need to be really careful about when and where it's going to apply, right? So if it was always the case that we needed people less better well off than us to to feel good about ourselves, then certainly political democracy, which is based on a fundamental one man or woman, one vote argument, seems to become pretty problematic, right? Certainly there are some social orders that are based on this logic. If you think about feudalism, old school aristocracy, there's a very famous political theorist by the name of Alexis de Tocqueville. He's doing all of this. Now I'll put these links online, but this link here is a really interesting link to how inequality can lead people, especially on the bottom end, to feel very insecure themselves, and can lead to certain sort of behavioral patterns that are derived from their lower social standing. So that's the is question. Let's look at the ought, right? Remember, ought is a normative goal that we should work towards. When is claims are made, let me hide myself so I can show you this as well. When is claims are made, we need to see empirical evidence, right? So you say this is the case, show me the money. I need to know, I need hard evidence, right? So scientific, statistical, just saying this is the case doesn't count, right? It's like Missouri, the show me state. Like, yeah, you say that's the case, show me. You got to prove it. When ought claims are made, we need to link them to theories, okay? So we'll be talking about some systematic theories coming up here in a minute. And yeah, some ought claims might be found to be untenable for is reasons, right? That's fine if we have the evidence that this is reason really is the reason that we're saying it is, right? So just keep that in mind. So the most important way of thinking about what's happening in political theory is this TAME, theory, argument, method, evidence method that I have come up with myself because I am so brilliant. Okay, not that brilliant, but I'm a pretty smart guy too. All right, what is a theory? A theory is a large systematic description of the political and social world that is both plausible. So, a theory needs to, right, it needs to be some sense plausible, right? If I said, humans are born from an alien race and therefore we have special DNA, blah, 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 I'm like, I don't know, come on, you gotta be kidding me. Maybe that's plausible, but it's not, it doesn't really meet the criteria of generally accepted plausibility, right? And B, we use our theories to derive political and moral claims about what we ought to do. So theories, bring myself back here a little bit, theories are big overarching ways of making sense and organizing everything that comes down in the social world from it, okay? So theories are big, they are systematic, frequently they claim to understand everything. I'm very skeptical that any one theory is right, but they're all good enough that if they were right, we really probably could use that theory to basically do all of political theory. So they're good. I mean, theories are big, strong, they're really important. Okay, what's after that? Arguments. Arguments are particular applications of theories to individual cases or circumstances, okay? Particular applications to individual cases or circumstances. Scientific tools here are very similar, okay? Like for a scientific thing, I would probably put hypothesis rather than argument here because we would be really trying to test each thing out. Testing matters in political theory, but not everything can be settled with a test. And then evidence. Evidence is method. Method is a means of investigating a problem or issue, okay? So in science, method might be a case study. In science, method might be statistical, right? We can use all of that in political theory, but what we add to it is a strong focus on argument. And because of this normative question, so we talk about values and what is justice and all of these kinds of things. And then finally, evidence is observation gathered by our method. Most of the evidence in political theory is textually based, meaning direct quotes from the authors. Basically, the same system works for political science or any other social science. It's a really good, fun, straightforward way of getting into what's happening. And, you know, scientific theories are A, plausible, but B, explanatory in that they're trying to explain political behavior, right? You should know this already if you've taken any political science, but you know, this lecture will go to different places. Some places will be more introductory students, some will be more advanced. If you're an advanced student, you should know this already. If you're an introductory student, maybe this is your first class in political science. That's what's happening in the rest of political science. They're trying to explain political behavior. Okay? And you know, all of these types of things are really good general research and reasoning skills that are applicable in any job. Okay? Now, let's talk about theories. For my introductory students, the first page is going to be enough here. For the advanced students, the second page is more important. So if you're watching this lecture for a community college that I'm working at, you don't need some of the stuff on the second page you need, but not as much, okay? And we'll be talking about all of this in class, or I have supplemental lectures, but this is just the sort of really quick 2-minute version. Liberalism. Liberalism is our first theory. When I say liberalism, I mean a historical, philosophical definition of liberalism. I do not mean Hillary Clinton. She also happens to be a philosophical liberal, but so is Ron Paul. Ron Paul's a libertarian. Why are libertarians called libertarians? Why does it sound so much like liberal? This is why. They share this fundamental way of thinking. They disagree on the consequences, but they basically agree on where to begin. That's the important point here. Okay, so liberalism is what? Liberalism is, number one, making arguments based on individual rights. Now, the question here is going to be, what is really an individual? We're going to spend a lot of time talking about that. But there's two basic versions of liberalism that we get. We get one, a Kantian Rawlsian version. So Immanuel Kant, 18th century Enlightenment thinker, maybe the greatest Enlightenment thinker of all time. Like, really, this guy is brilliant. He worked on tools he had gotten from John Locke and some Rousseau and Thomas Hobbes and a bunch of other places, and he put them together in a new way that really kind of set the type for how a lot of modern liberals are thinking. So Kant kind of brought together all these liberal pieces and really kind of put them together in an important new way. In the 20th century, the most important liberal Kantian interpreter that we have is John Rawls. And John Rawls is building from Kant, doing a little bit of other stuff. But what they're both doing together is they're saying, look, the definition of person that matters is that we have reason. And that reason is not just a thing that helps us get what we want, but really is part of the moral makeup of persons. And it enables us to live our lives in a moral manner, meaning free will, treat others with respect. Kant has this formulation, treat others as ends in themselves, meaning other people have desires and wants and wills, and we need to respect them as having an intrinsic value of their own. Our second version is the libertarian version. And in contrast to big R reason, which is basically the Rawlsian Kantian version, reason's really up here creating natural laws. Everyone's going to follow natural laws. We're kind of going to get pretty similar answers to the majority of moral questions we're going to ask. The libertarian vision really gives up on that whole ends in themselves way of thinking and says, look, people just have desires and wants, and the best thing to do is to let people pursue their own thing in their own way. So notice this is an important difference from the Kantian Rawlsian version. You know, Kant, because he has such a strong belief that reason can lead to morality, Kant therefore is able to derive a kind of universal morality from this way of thinking. Libertarians, not so much universal morality. Sure, we shouldn't kill each other, we shouldn't harm each other, so there's a few things we're going to have to tick off the list, but after that, it's all just choice, okay? And so this is why I focus on not big R reason, but little r reason. Someone like Robert Nozick, a famous American political philosopher, is in this way of thinking. So in this case, individual rights are less based on our capacity for reason, but more just a means for us to protect our property, okay? So we have stuff, we like stuff, we want to keep our stuff. We agree not to take stuff from one another, and pretty much as long as that's it, as long as that's what's going on, everything is just exchange and it's all fine. So no force, no fraud. Other than that, there's not a whole lot of rules. Our second most common way of thinking, so for an introductory class, this is really important for you, is what we call republicanism. Frequently, civic republicanism is the term that will come up. This notion, this way of thinking, is based on citizenship and the common good. Version A is man is a political animal, more focused on the relationship of citizen. Version B is man is a social animal, focused on social relationships of family, church, business, etc., as realms of life that the political is meant to protect. But notice the big difference here between these two theories. People are individuals, theory one, people are individuals, we're going to base our politics off of individual rights. Theory two, people are social animals. We're going to base our politics off a notion of citizenship or membership, whether it's church, community, family. These are critical key words for civic Republicans that liberals, quite frankly, don't like. When you say community to a liberal, they get really nervous. They go, I don't know. Why? Because community can interfere with your individual rights. It does quite frequently. And individual rights can be a real threat to community. So civic Republicans and liberals have this dynamic tension. There's certain things they agree on. Don't get me wrong. It's not like, complete opposites, but there's a lot of things that they disagree on. Okay, more theories. So for my more advanced students, my intro students will do a little bit of 3 and 4, and a little bit of 6. Mostly kind of 3 and 4. 6 is just easy. You throw that in. It's like kind of a no-brainer. It's a freebie. So Marxism. Look, Marxism is a really important lineage, a way of thinking. If you don't like Marx, whatever, I get it. But the thing is, Marx was part of creating social science. So whether it's economics, yes, he's a great economist, actually, especially for his time. I mean, 200 years have gone by, so, fair enough. It's like, we don't have to agree with him on everything. That's not an issue. But wow, Marx really pushed all of social science in a much more scientific direction. So he deserves his credit. You don't have to like him. I don't care. But he's still important, so we're going to learn him. Marxism, 2 main versions of Marxism. The first is structural. The second is critical. Structural communism is the one that you probably don't like. Communism is coming. It's inevitable. The capitalist system is contradictory and going to collapse and blah, 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 right? Okay, I get it. That's what old school Marxism was, largely around the time of Karl Marx's life. This is also a little bit more of a political Marxism, so obviously Stalin and Lenin and all the Russian guys, they liked this way of thinking because it sort of made them out to be on the vanguard, the forefront of history. Not a big fan of structural Marxism. It has some good points, so I don't want to just toss it out and say oh, it's stupid, nobody cares, we should just, we just don't do that in political theory. But look, you have to buy a lot of assumptions, and it's unclear that those are assumptions that are worth buying. Okay, critical. Critical Marxism is much more useful and helpful. Critical Marxism was developed by what's called critical theory, or sometimes the Frankfurt School in Germany, right before World War II. And these were communists in Germany, intellectuals who were doing really interesting work in anthropology, literature, philosophy, economics. I mean, sort of very interdisciplinary way of thinking. But what happened was they saw the abuses in Russia and they turned against critical Marxism and they said, look, something's gone wrong here. And so they started questioning these more structural assumptions um, and came up with a much more malleable, it's called critical theory because it doesn't posit the same way Marxism or liberalism does, a kind of endpoint. It's a very skeptical orientation. So really kind of trying to break down our common assumptions about world works like X, you know. And the critical theorists say, well, does it really, right? And they really want to sort of question that all of our assumptions. One of the main things the critical theorists do, and this is for the advanced students more, my introductory students get a version of structural Marxism, a good version of structural Marxism, the best one I can come up with. The advanced students, we do more critical theory version. But basically, critical theory is Marxism backfilled with more Hegel and added to with some original insights. The critical theorists use what they call a negative dialectic. So coming from Hegel, who, if you don't know who he is, doesn't matter, but first you have Hegel, then you have Marx. So Marx builds from Hegel and like transforms and changes a bunch of stuff. And Marx builds from Hegel's main method, which is called the dialectical method. Marx builds from that, and that's how he comes to most of his most big world-changing kind of conclusions, is building from Hegel's notion of a dialectic. Well, the critical theorists begin to question a lot of that. And what they do is they do two things. First, they add more Hegel back into Marx. So Marx is built from Hegel, but he also turned away from Hegel. But that door is kind of open. So that back door to Hegel is just kind of sitting there. And they just walk through it and they say, how's Hegel going to help? And Hegel actually really helps Marx. Today, I would say most Marxists are actually really just Hegelians. And they should be more honest about that. Hegel's much more persuasive, although much harder to understand. Secondly, rather than viewing the Hegelian method as one that necessarily leads to progress and change, they want to view it as one that breaks down our notions of what is stable and certain. So that's why it's a negative dialectic. Hegel thought his dialectic led to higher stages of living. He used it to explain historical change. That's why it was so helpful to Marx. And Marx's thing of communism's coming, the dialectic really helps. The negative dialectic wants to break all of that down. Are you so certain about your assumptions? Our next one that we'll see a little bit in introductory courses, but not a lot, is Foucault and postmodernism. What Foucault does is he builds from some critical theory, but he adds in a whole bunch of Friedrich Nietzsche. So remember Nietzsche, what I talked about from earlier? And I have this nice little, we didn't all have a nice presentation on Foucault. That was actually from a particular class, so take that out. But Nietzsche plus critical theory equals Foucault, okay? So you take some of that critical theory skepticism, you, in this case, rather than going to Hegel further, which Foucault is very skeptical of, and I have to agree with him on this, you go to Friedrich Nietzsche, who, like I said, is one of the most important political theorists of all time. You go do that, and you get this really cool kind of complex that really focuses on how power itself creates the criterion of truth. Foucault is a postmodern. He is hugely skeptical of claims of this is truth. When you hear someone say this is the truth, Foucault says, ask what their interest here is. Why are they trying to push this as the truth? Make you think a second time about truth. It's really good. All right, so that's Foucault. For my advanced students as well, then we also have Decisionism, which comes from this guy, Carl Schmitt, who was a Nazi. So there's a longer lecture here. But in this case, it's some Catholic ultra-political theory who aren't important enough to really talk about on their own right, but they're still important. For a 19th century class, you might talk about them, or a class on the Enlightenment, you might talk about them, because the Catholic ultras were part of the counter-Enlightenment, so they were really mad about the French Revolution, which did not go very well. And so Carl Schmitt's Decisionism is a little bit of Catholic ultra political theory plus Nietzsche. So you see Nietzsche's going multiple ways here. He can be used by different people. And one of the best things about this type of decisionism is it's a really strong argument against utopia. I mean, that's really what Schmitt sort of was trying to do. He was also living in Germany pre and through World War II. So Germany was just a complete mess. There was utopians everywhere. The economy was a disaster. I mean, just really kind of out of control. But he really wanted to articulate a political theory against utopia. His political theory is pretty conservative, but today it's been picked up by some lefties, so it can kind of go both ways. And then the last theory here is utilitarianism or consequentialism. So to a certain extent, this is Isaiah Berlin. He's a kind of utilitarian consequentialist. This way of thinking crosses with libertarian approaches rather strongly, so it kind of brings us back to that first step in the circle. And really, the utilitarian consequentialist approach is to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. So focus on answering things scientifically. You know, what's going to be best for everybody? When Spock says, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one, and he sacrifices himself to save the Enterprise, he's thinking in a utilitarian or consequentialist manner, okay? Which theory is right? Look, man, I just don't know. We don't know which theory is right, so just get that thought out of your head. This is why we have more than one, and that's important. It's actually really important to have more than one. And if it was really obvious which theory is right, I would just tell you. Some professors go down that path kind of like, well, you could do this, you could do that, but this is the one, right? And like, I just think that's annoying. I want you to understand that all of these theories are really good and really strong. Where you start, however, does affect where you end up. Let me give you a few analogies for thinking about different theories. It's like different fighting styles, for example. I don't have time to do that. I can do that out in a second. Different fighting styles. Kung Fu versus Judo. Kung Fu is kicking and punching. Think Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan. Classic, great for the movies, really good way of fighting, but not perfect. There's weaknesses. Specifically, Kung Fu is pretty weak to Judo techniques. This is why MMA is the basic distinction in MMA between Kung Fu and Judo. And everyone's doing both, but some guys are more kickers and punchers and some guys are more wrestlers. So Judo is much more wrestling, and your goal is to close in close to your opponent, grab a hold of them, and then take them down to the ground, where you have all these holds and wrestling techniques to, this is like choking people out in MMA. I don't really like MMA. I don't think it's that exciting, but it's a good analogy. Or it could be sports. Different systems of offense and defense, right? How you put together your offense and defense affects how easy it is to score. It affects what your opponent needs to do, all of that kind of stuff. In football, there's a basic defensive difference between a 3-4 and a 4-3 offense. The 4-3 is supposed to be better against the run. The 3-4 a little bit better against the pass. Some other differences. Are you still playing football? Heck yeah. Do the differences matter? Heck yeah. Right? All of it. This all matters. Cooking, for example, depending on what you're cooking, you use very different techniques. If you're making a soup, you throw it all in the pot, turn it on for 4 hours, take it out, tastes really good. If you're baking, you got to have your things just right. So civic republicanism, it's actually a little bit more like a souping sort of method. You throw all the different groups in a pot, turn it on, let it roll for a little while. 4 hours later, it's going to taste really good. Liberalism is much more baking. You got to get everything just right, but if you get it just right, you get this wonderful, tasty cake with the frosting on top and everything is delicious, right? So again, which theory is right? I don't know. okay? And it doesn't really matter. We just want to learn all of the theories, okay? And I gotta erase a little bit of this. We've done frequently. I do Pascal's wager in class. So this is based off a lecture I had been using in class, and then I modified it for general use. And here we go. Okay, arguments. Let's talk about arguments. Arguments are particular applications of theories. When we make arguments, we want to be very careful about how we go about doing it. There are two basic types of arguments. One, deductive arguments. Deductive arguments are watertight. They always hold no matter what. You can go scuba diving with it 1,000 leagues under the sea and it's not going to crack, okay? It'd be great if all arguments could be made this way, but the fact is it's very rare to find deductive arguments. Usually we spend our time with inductive arguments. Inductive are some, most, a certain percentage type of arguments. They don't always hold, but you know, we try to find evidence to say we think in this case this argument does hold. No, we're not 100% certain, and we want to do all of that. A, we have evidence to think that this argument in this case holds. B, no, we're not 100% certain. You know, here's some of the limits to what we're doing, etc. Let me give you an example. This is like the classic example of a deductive argument that's been used for 100 years. So kind of like goofy, but Socrates is a man. All men are mortal. Therefore, Socrates is immortal, right? A particular, a universal, a conclusion, super fast, super easy, no problems. Let me give you an example of an inductive argument. 60% of people, I don't know the exact numbers here, but it doesn't really matter. 60% of people who go to church regularly vote Republican. Socrates goes to church every weekend. Therefore, he is more likely, but not certain, to vote Republican. That's an inductive argument. And what are we going to do for our next step? Okay, let's go try to find additional evidence for Socrates' voting behavior. If not, we're going to have to be happy with a probabilistic conclusion, right? So we could go ask Socrates, hey man, how'd you vote? Do you always vote Republican? What do you think about voting? Blah, 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 blah. Ask him a whole bunch of questions. That would be additional evidence. Or we could have some other type of inductive argument and add to it. 60% of men maybe are vote Republican. Socrates is a man. Okay, so now we have two different probabilistic arguments, both in favor of Socrates voting Republican. Well, that's going to increase how confident we feel about this argument. We're still going to acknowledge that we're not 100% confident. There are three main parts to arguments. Assumptions. So one possible assumption could be individuals act only on self-interest, right? That's an assumption. People use this one a lot in science. We actually do use this one relatively frequently. It's not a bad assumption. But even for assumptions, we need to have reasons and evidence, okay? So the truth is, well, I'll show you this later, this is an assumption you can use, but it's limited in its utility, partially based upon the fact it doesn't actually hold 100% in the real world at all. But in some cases, it holds pretty strongly. So depending on what you're looking at, it's a better or worse assumption. But, you know, so long as we have decent, pretty good reasons for our assumptions, then political theorists tend to accept them, at least provisionally. So like, okay, look, the self-interest assumption maybe isn't perfect, but I understand why you're using it here. It seems to be appropriate in this case. Let's move forward, right? Second, premises. Premises are the parts of your argument, i.e. Socrates is a man, or all men are mortal. These are both premises to our arguments. We want to have evidence for these as well. So a picture of Socrates. Socrates is a man. Okay, can I see a picture of him? It would be okay to say woman. We could have said human or person, right? But right, all men are mortal. Okay, great. Like that's really helpful. And then conclusion is whatever you conclude, right? We might even want to have evidence for all men are mortal. In this case, it's very intuitive. We see that everyone dies, so there you go. But, you know, if we said, you know, like the individuals act only on self-interest, woo, doggy, you'd better, right? Like if you're going to take that assumption and make it a premise in your argument, you got to make sure you have some good reasons for that, okay? let's talk about some criteria of strong and weak arguments. There's no sort of definitive list. I kind of wish there was. Philosophers should just put together a board and like just do it, but they haven't yet. So what are you going to do? First, we want to have plausible assumptions and premises, right? So we don't want, like I said earlier, there's alien DNA and aliens built the pyramids. Like, okay, what's your evidence? The evidence really flimsy. I'm a little nervous about building a argument off of that. Second, we want to try to be logically rigorous. So if you can be deductive, I mean, that's the ideal. If you can't be deductive, that's fine. You just want to be clear about the limits of your inductive argument and how strong it really is. We also need to reference empirical evidence where appropriate. We also need to be very specific or qualify our arguments, right? This argument applies in these cases and not those cases, okay? This argument takes me this far and no further. So we want to be really clear about how the argument applies. We also want to concede or be self-critical. So concession might be, critics of this way of thinking argue X, and this is actually an important objection that we need to think about, and it's strong for these reasons, etc., etc. And maybe they have a good point and you need to just dial back your argument a little bit. Maybe you can construct a response that's a sufficient response. All okay. And then deals with counter arguments in a fair and generous manner. So we call this the principle of charity. And it's called the principle of charity because it's very common to say, oh, well, people disagree with this, but, they're just stupid, or, they argue this and that's unreasonable. That's like a straw man kind of argument. And dealing with our critics, what really separates good philosophers from bad philosophers or political theorists in the end is how willing and able they are to construct arguments on the other side. So construct objections in a smart, strong manner, and then respond or just acknowledge, like, okay, here's a limit to my argument, and that's fine, okay? So this is funny, what not to wear in an argument, right? So these are some common mistakes people run into in making arguments. First, false equivalency. So everybody does it, therefore they're all equally bad. Well, maybe, but then I need to see evidence actually proving real equivalency, right? So, some people will say, well, everybody's biased. Well, okay, sure, everybody's biased. Are we all equally biased? Or some of us have a little bit of bias and some of us have a lot? Well, if some of us have a little and some of us have a lot, we need to be really careful about mobilizing the everybody's biased objection. If some people are scientific and maybe do have biases but are trying very hard to overcome them, we should treat the evidence that comes from those kinds of people stronger than someone who's like, climate change denier and just cherry picking evidence, and it's just like ridiculous, and they're paid by, oil companies. Like, well, okay, so that's serious bias, and then you're saying, well, maybe you have a little bit of unconscious bias, blah, blah, blah. Well, okay, sure, but there's a difference in quality kind of bias in those cases. So, false equivalency. Secondly, or all politicians lie, but some of them lie more than others, right? So all politicians lie. Sure, I'm willing to admit all politicians play with the truth. Some of them are bald-faced liars and some of them stretch the truth. That's an important distinction, right? And if we just say they all lie, that's a false equivalency. All right, next one. Next common mistake people make. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is trying to stack the deck in your favor or cherry pick arguments and evidence to fit a preconceived notion. Oops, take that out. Don't need that. There we go. To fit a preconceived notion, okay? Just we see this all the time, people discount information they don't like, and they only focus on information they like. This happens a lot with climate change deniers. It happens with the anti-vaxxers. They have like one study that's been debunked 50 times, but they're holding on to that one study. And they're like, no, I have this one study, and all those other 50 studies, they don't get it, and they miss this, and they miss that. It's like, look, man, we have 50 studies. The guy who wrote the one study saying vaccines might lead to autism is a total fraud. They took his medical license away, and you're holding on to this. Like, you gotta let this one go. The evidence is not there for you, anti-vaxxers. I'm really sorry. Sorry. Okay. Confirmation bias. This is a real danger in all of science and theory. Ad hominems, which is just basically counterattacks based on personal failings. So, well, Martin Luther King cheated on his wife, so we shouldn't hold him up as a civil rights icon. Well, sure. I mean, not like it's good to cheat on your wife. That's definitely not the case. But cheating on your wife makes you a bad husband. Fighting against injustice makes you a national hero, right? And most of our presidents have also cheated on their wives. So if we're going to trot this one out, we're going to also be throwing out a whole bunch of other people that I think we want to keep as well. Circular reasoning or tautology. This is another common mistake. The Bible is the Word of God because God wrote it, right? There's no way out of this argument. Arguments, we tend to try to argue in a line. This is a circular argument. Bible was written by God. God wrote the Bible. Therefore, we have to believe it. It's not necessarily always wrong. Like, there are some things that are mutually constitutive, as we say, but a lot of these arguments don't work out so well. So what do we need? Well, show me proof, and not just I said so, that God actually wrote the Bible, right? Like, where's the pen he used to write it with? Where's the video evidence of him writing it down or talking to, it's like we need evidence for these things. And if we just point to the Bible again, it's like, well, but that's the thing we're talking about. So now we're stuck in this circular logic. Here's another one that comes up. The free market gives to people what they deserve. What they deserve is what the free market gives them, right? So market gives you what you deserve. What you deserve is what the market gives you. What's the problem here? We need an outside definition of just desserts, which I think would be a funny name for a dessert joint. Just call it just desserts. To match with distribution of goods by the free market. So, for example, a failure here is Van Gogh is now an incredibly famous painter, but in his lifetime, no one recognized him, right? So what's the conclusion? If the market gives you what you deserve, and what you deserve is what the market gives you, then Van Gogh was a bad painter by definition when he was alive, and he didn't deserve to be, his paintings did not deserve to get bought. And then once he died, somehow the market changed, and now he's a great painter just because his paintings get sold for a lot of money. I think we need some kind of outside criteria of what makes a painter good or bad, right? Lots of artists are very good artists. They really are, and they just don't make money, and they're not recognized, and they're forgotten. Doesn't mean they're bad artists. It just means they didn't, their album didn't hit #1 on the Billboard. Doesn't mean it's not a good album. More mistakes. Equivocation. But maybe this author has bias, right? So kind of bias is one of the things that come up a lot when people are made, oh, but you're just biased, or you're da, da, da. Well, okay, sure. Show me the bias, right? If you want to claim someone has bias, you need to have evidence for it, right? Or another one. Let's think of it this way. Claim, Japanese internment was wrong during World War II. Equivocal objection. Isn't it better to put Japanese in internment camps than to have the Holocaust? Right? Problem. Certainly this is a true statement, but these are pretty clearly both bad, and the argument is trying to make one of them look good by comparing it to a worse thing. Equivocation, right? How about a third option? We're not jerks to people. We neither kill them nor take away their property and put them in an internment camp. Rather, we let them live their lives like normal people and give them like rights. That sounds like a pretty good option to me, right? Another common mistake, straw man. Constructing your opponent's argument in a purposefully weak form to make yourself look good. That's a really common mistake that people make. And another one is post hoc ergo propter hoc. Just a big fancy word that means after this, therefore because of this. So because one thing came after another, therefore they're caused by that. In science, we have this distinction between correlation and causation. Correlation are two things that appear together. We don't know if one is necessarily causing the other, but they do tend to come together. And causation is we are very confident that this thing is causing some other thing, right? So, just because something comes after something else doesn't mean it's causing it. So you have to be very careful about that. Correlation is not causation. There's lots more mistakes that people have. It's okay. Why is it hard to do these things sometimes? So if you've ever had a political conversation around the dinner table or Thanksgiving, which is the worst, and everyone's just, oh, well, you can't say that because if you do this and that'll happen, it's all gonna be chaos, right? Everyone's just like going crazy. It's hard to do it. Well, largely a couple reasons. One, our ego/confirmation bias gets in the way. We're hung up on being right. Our sense of self is invested in being correct about these things. Political arguments are part of our identity. So we feel good when we are right, not right. We feel good when we are right. Well, I get that. You got to get comfortable with being wrong. Philosophers we're okay being wrong. We're like, tell me I'm wrong. Someone says, I'll tell you why you're wrong. And okay, and try to listen, try to think about it, right? Funny point here. Parties with political science professors are the worst because, I didn't finish that sentence, because our ego gets in the way. Oh, there we go. Because our ego is invested in being correct. Okay, so there we go. Time to get over your ego just a little bit, right? Just because this is the case, however, doesn't mean we shouldn't work against this, okay? So, I don't expect perfection, but I do expect effort, right? And then, another reason why we're having a hard time with it, here we go, is because of hyperpolarization in the United States today. Everybody is really dug in, and everything you try to say is just completely hyperpoliticized. And, Republicans are all fascists, liberals hate freedom. You can watch this cool visualization for thinking about it. Okay, some more things to think about when we're making arguments. We want to use philosophy verbs and other words, okay? Nouns and adjectives as well. Philosophers think and argue. We don't believe. We don't have, belief is for religion. Belief is for something that's not been questioned, that you don't have evidence for. We think and we argue. We also hold assumptions, right? Or arguments, right? So not just assumptions, but also arguments. We hold them like it's in our hand. We're holding an argument. When you hold it, you can look at it. You can say, okay, what are the dimensions of this argument? Where is it? What theory is it drawing from? What are its strengths and what are its weaknesses? And so holding arguments is a really important way to think here. We also construct arguments, just like a house. We put them together piece by piece by piece. We build them up, and then at the top, our conclusion is the roof, okay? We then construct objections and consider responses to those objections. So I built up my house. Somebody says, it looks weak over here. I say, oh, that's a good point. Maybe I need to shore up that wall a little bit. Maybe I need to rebuild that entire side of my house. Maybe he's wrong. And maybe I have a really good response. I say, look, I know that doesn't look exactly the way you would expect it to, but notice it's very strongly built. Here's the reasons why. Give it a kick, see what happens, see if the whole house comes falling down, right? And then we also make distinctions, so basic distinctions between liberalism and republicanism, right? Different Theories are basically just distinctions as well. Okay, let's talk about methods. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is, again, a little bit more for my advanced students. So I'm going to try to push through this a little bit quickly. But one, analytic methods. Analytic methods are all the stuff I just covered on how to argue, okay? All political theory is to some extent based on analytic methods because it helps us keep our concepts, categories, arguments, premises, assumptions, objections, responses, all of that clear. So we always want to be sort of making very clear arguments. 2, historical. Well, historical method can be combined with analytics, so we can always combine our different methods. But historical methods look at debates contextually as a way of identifying authors' meanings. Who was Carl Schmitt, for example, actually arguing with? Well, he was arguing with these guys in Germany, right? And to really properly understand the argument he's making, it's important to know who he's arguing against. Arguments kind of exist in this kind of like relational sort of way of thinking, okay? Frequently, people today call this text and context. A lot of my work does this. And it's intended to create a kind of map of meaning. And then once we have one map of meaning in the past, we can find similar debates and situations today and use our analysis of the past to think through them. Or we can reintroduce these meanings back into our analytic philosophical debates, feeling a bit more secure in our definitions. For my advanced class, we read a piece by Fred Lee on Japanese internment, and also a piece by me on education policy in France. And those are both historical projects, historical methods with strong analytic payoff. More methods, scientific. So scientific, really great way of getting evidence that's going to help us. Sociological is a kind of scientific way of thinking. Sociology is a science, but it can help us think very strongly about society and why things are happening. So that's an important method as well. And then finally, critical, again, coming from our critical theorist Marxism. You know, it's unclear if critical theory itself, again, this is a little more for the advanced students, is a method or a theory. It's a method in the sense that it's a way of doing research. It has some theoretical underpinnings because it comes out of Marxism, but it's questioning its own assumptions. So critical theory gets to double up. The analytical method basically works in 3 steps. 1, construct an argument usually from one theory applied to one circumstance, right? So we'll construct a theory and apply it to gender in the family. Step 2, develop an objection to this argument. Step 3, consider responses to the objection and counter responses to the response on the part of the objector, right? So you have an objection, I object, you explain your objection. Then step 3, you think of a response from the original argument, and then you get them going back and forth at each other for a little while, okay? After that, you just simply rinse and repeat. Okay, go back to step 1 or step 2, depending on what is appropriate. Frequently, there are multiple objections that you need to consider. All of the theories and methods are right to a certain degree. Okay, I frequently use, another analogy I use is an analogy of being a judge versus being a lawyer. A lawyer uses any argument, no matter how wacky, to defend his client. A judge uses established rules of interpretation to weigh evidence and make a ruling based upon those rules. We have a distinction here that I like between opinion. So opinion is just what you like. So I like to say opinions are like bums. Everybody's got one, right? Everyone's got an opinion. Okay, great. So it's my opinion. Better than opinion and necessary for this class is judgment. Judgment is an argument based upon clear logic, even if not perfection, and evidence. We need argument and evidence. And if you have those 2 things, you have a judgment. If you just have an opinion, you think something, fine, great, you think it. Show me the evidence, construct the argument. One common objection people have is like, well, okay, but isn't everything just self-interest and like what we call instrumental rationality? Just I'm trying to get more stuff and I just want to win arguments. It doesn't matter what the heck else is going on. And that could be the case, but frequently when people offer this, it's kind of an equivocal objection. Like, oh, well, but maybe not. People are just self-interested, so we just don't know. That's a very frequent way that people do this, okay? Oh, we don't need all of this either. Um, um, Now, there are objections to this. And, some people think, like Foucault, look at what we could call anti-foundationalist ethics, and that's trying to build a theory without a really, really strong sort of primary assumption. Liberals say individual rights. Republicans say man is a social animal. The answer you get, though, if you try to go this anti-foundationalist line, is not everything is permitted, just lie to people and get your own way, right? Even if you say, well, there's a lot of power happening and we need to have a good power analysis, even if you do that, you don't conclude, or it's very rare to conclude that, well, okay, so we're just going to do whatever we want, no rules, right? Even Machiavelli, who's so famous for saying the ends justify the means, he thinks that lesser amounts of violence are better than more. So he still has these distinctions and moral things he cares about, okay? So Machiavelli is basically a minimum type of violence necessary. Carl Schmitt is very similar. So there you go. Most people think foundationally, meaning one of the systems that we're presenting in this class are sort of going to fit their political opinions and attitudes. You're a liberal, you're a Republican, you're a Marxist, maybe Hegelian, right? One of those three, either foundationalist ways of thinking, or maybe Carl Schmitt decisionism. Schmitt argues politics looks like X, right? So he's got a definition of politics, then he goes out into the world and he says, look, here's how it works in the world, we should do Y. Liberals do the same thing, Republicans do the same thing, Marxist Hegelians do the same thing. So libertarians doing the same thing. So it doesn't matter where you're coming from, you're doing this kind of foundationalist thing. My hope is that you can comprehend multiple foundations, okay? Now, okay, are we all just self-interested? This is a really common objection that people like to have. Well, so we have this notion, we could call it Homoeconomicus. That's just a Latinized way of saying people are motivated by self-interest only. So everything is self-interest. The extreme version of this would be that extreme Machiavellianism is good. We should lie in order to get our own way. So anything in order to have your own self-interest, that's one way of doing it. And we should lie unless telling the truth would get us what we want faster, in which case we should tell the truth, right? In this way of thinking, the very concept of altruism or non-interested behavior is simply wrong. It doesn't exist. But that's a big assumption, right? We can use this assumption in economics sometimes. It works really well. In political science, it gets us some good purchase on how politicians behave. But voters don't always act in perfectly self-interested ways. Think of this, like Trump won amongst white middle-class men and women. And what's he doing now? Cutting bunches of social services, not even middle class, working class, lower class. He's cutting a bunch of the services that they rely on very heavily. That's not a self-interested action on their part. They voted based on something else that just wasn't their self-interest. Okay. Now notice, I'm not saying self-interest here is always wrong and doesn't matter, right? That would be the straw man version of, oh, well, you say it's not always self-interest, but you're saying it's never self-interest. No, I said it's not always self-interest. Very clear distinctions here. That's our whole point. We have to be very careful about that, okay? So, sure, self-interest matters. So do lots of other things, okay? So, for example, what about people who rescued Jews, right? Lots of examples of, rescuing behavior, and people did it and they kind of said, damn the consequences, you know. I just feel like this is right. And so being, you know, we're not always motivated by moral considerations of being right, but certainly sometimes we are. And if Homoeconomicus was the way to go, we certainly wouldn't have kids because it costs $200,000 to raise a kid. And who's going to get married? Well, maybe you'd get married because married does have financial payoff. So maybe you'd get married. But would you learn to play a musical instrument? Nope. Doesn't pay off. Another kind of equivocal objection people have to, you know, just arguments in general. But people don't want to, right? Well, yeah, no kidding. People don't want to. There's no doubt that people who are benefiting from a system of power don't want to give up the benefits that they're, you know, getting from it, you know, or, you know, whatever it is. So, okay, people don't want to. Look, if we have a strong claim saying something's wrong, something's right, then we need to consider that on its own merits. And if people don't want to do it, maybe we should pass a new law changing how people need to behave. And if some people don't like it, maybe that's okay. It's not always about what people like or want, right? So we want to keep that in mind. You know, and secondly, there's lots of things that we can do. So it's not like government is always the right answer, right? But for example, in the case of extreme violations of personal safety for religious, racial, or ethnic reasons, I mean, I feel very confident in saying that we really should use the government to protect minorities. Government equals force, no matter who they are, right? Like killing people is just not okay. So we're not going to let people kill people, right? Or systematically discriminate against them as they did in the South during Jim Crow and segregation. So what did we do? We passed a law. We desegregated schools. People didn't like it. Too bad. We sent in the National Guard to enforce desegregation. I mean, maybe we shouldn't have done that, but I don't know. I think from all the points of view that you look at, and almost, you know, pretty much all, maybe there's one or two you could get out of it, and, you know, in the 5 different theories I showed you, but boy, oh boy, you know, that's a good thing. I have a really hard time saying using governmental power to end extreme discrimination is a bad thing. You know, so justice claims also entail an obligation to what we ought to do. So if there's something going wrong, we should fix it. And so it's a justice claim. Justice claims entail an obligation for compensation and or retribution. If you steal from me, I get my stuff back and maybe a little bit more. So you steal from me, I get my car back. And you might also be forced to pay the legal costs or some other type of compensation for making up for what I lost, right? Now let's take a look at an example. I'm going to start by making a distinction between retributive and distributive justice. Retributive justice is the death penalty and criminal penalties, right? Retribution. You do something wrong, you have to pay the cost. So eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That was actually a retributive justice argument of proportionality in punishment, right? So you also want the punishment to fit the crime. So, you know, cutting someone's tongue off for lying might be a little extreme, you know, but fining them for the damage they did is probably a little bit better. You know, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. If someone takes $100 from you, they have to give you the $100 back. Maybe a little bit more. I mean, you know, exactly where the proportion is hard to say, but proportionality really matters. If we're talking about gender, race, class inequalities, social things, we're talking about distributive justice. It's a question of the distribution of goods and resources in a society. Okay. One common sector of distributive justice questions is in the realm of gender and family life. And liberals, remember our philosophical liberals, they tend to focus on equal treatment based upon individual rights. This argument creates a very strong claim for equal treatment in the family and society more generally, right? But we also have considerations of diversity and difference. Although the justice claim to equal treatment has intuitive power, so does the claim that the state just telling parents how to raise kids seems to interfere with parents having the freedom to perpetuate their cultural differences by passing them on to their children. So, interesting, right? Well, there's this really strong claim here, but like, gosh, there's this kind of funny almost conclusion that makes us feel a little bit uncomfortable with, how are we going to, go through these two things? But the truth is there's tons of evidence showing unequal treatment between boys and girls in the family. Girls are expected to do more housework. Girls don't get as much preferential treatment when it comes to what movie you're going to see, what you're going to do on your Saturday, all of these types of things. Boys are just given tons of preferential treatment in families. Well, in a way, that's really messed up. If you're a girl, you probably know what I'm talking about. But at the same time, it's like, well, should boys and girls really be treated perfectly equally? Well, maybe we don't want to get rid of gender roles entirely, but come on, housework, can't boys do their own laundry, right? Like if you're a sister, you may have been asked to do your brother's laundry at some point. Come on, doing laundry is not hard. It's easy. You can do laundry. So first, let's bring some empirical evidence to bear here. Like, is there a strong connection between biology and social gender roles, right? So let's look into the world and get some empirical evidence to help us think about some of this gender stuff. Okay, well, not just the Navajo, but so many other societies have had more than two genders. So sex is the part that you're born with, okay? Like keep that in mind. Sex is biological, gender is social. So some places have had 5 genders. Navajo. In India, there's 3 genders. Many other places, gender roles are just very different from where they are in the United States. So which set of gender roles are we going to pick as the right, true match with your biology? That gets really hard, right? Second, interestingly though, the biggest genetic difference in the human race is between men and women. So racial, ethnic stuff, like 0 difference, like marginal at the edges, basically no genetic difference whatsoever. Occasionally some predisposition to certain types of diseases, obviously skin color, hair, eye color, all of these types of things. But these genetic differences are minuscule. I know they get big play socially, but genetically they don't exist, basically. I mean, they're there, but they're really, 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 really small. Between men and women, well, we share 98.5% of DNA. So the biggest DNA difference you can find in the human race is between men and women. That's interesting. But there's, again, like I said, there's so much cultural variation in these roles that, boy, saying here's the right place is really hard. And we even have cases of women who look woman, have born a woman, but actually have a Y chromosome, so they should have developed as a man. It happens. Crazy stuff happens, man. Even though the biggest difference between between humans is gender-based, boy, these biological differences are not a straight line into what sex you end up having. So, the genetic problem here is, well, wow, we have this just gulf between the genetics and the social, and maybe even if we could overcome that gulf, the genetic side is unstable. So we can't even hold, it'd be great if we could hold on to the genetics and say, well, at least there's this, but like that starts to crumble. And like maybe there's something there, but boy, whew. And then, beyond that, we have, let's look down here at the bottom one. Beyond that, we even have 0.05% of people, that's less than 1%. It's about 1 out of 100. It's about 5 out of every 10,000 people. But that's not insignificant at all, are born intersex, meaning they're born with some of each boy and girl body part. Just think about that, right? Sometimes their sexual body parts will actually change through their lives. Just let that sit in. You could be born a woman and then you hit puberty and you grow a penis. That's crazy, and it totally happens. So, I mean, what's the point here? Boy, gender, I mean, sex, the biological part here is, I mean, I'm just trying to show you like how much that can kind of like break apart. And in lots of other species, not so much mammals, but lots of other species, we have like gender switching is easy. Like they run into a woman and they're currently is a woman and then they just switch and then they can reproduce that way. So as far as that goes, like on this biological sort of gender level, there's this intimate, intense connection between the male and the female. Now, with all that said, um, the strongest argument I can come up with is based upon some sort of general men are a little bit stronger and physically more capable of doing things like war making, and it is possible that testosterone makes men more violent. Okay, that's possible. I mean, though, you know, not all men, but like a statistical tendency towards this type of thing. So, for example, basically 90% of crime worldwide is by men. So maybe, although there still could be a social cause here, it could be because crime is more because we have social expectations that men are supposed to behave certain ways. Men are supposed to get good jobs. Men are supposed to buy fancy cars, blah, blah, blah. You don't have the opportunity to fit that social expectation. You turn to a life of crime. That's not a ridiculous argument. So, you know, again, don't take me as saying men are more violent by nature, but it's a possibility. And it's a possibility I'm willing to entertain. On the other hand, I'm absolutely also willing to entertain the social argument here that I just explained to you. Who's right? This one's actually a really hard one to figure out. Like, I don't know. I do know that the social factor, though, is pretty strong. I'm not going to lie to you about that. Testosterone, I don't know. I get it, right? Okay. So maybe there's some differences, right? But here's the rub. As far as I can tell, yes, men get a little more war making and physical labor, largely because we're just bigger and stronger. So why do you always ask your friend with the truck to help you move? Because he's got the freaking truck, right? So, you know, okay, yeah, I mean, but does that mean then that the biology is driving the behavior, or that the biology just creates men who are bigger and stronger, and then social need assigns that role to men, and then they start to act that way? Think about that, right? And I already did the intersex thing. So, you know, let's return to that liberal argument, right? Well, shouldn't we have equal treatment for men and women? Right? This is a strong, right? People love to complain about feminism or love feminism, and but liberal, in the terms of philosophically liberal feminism, is a really important way of thinking about women's rights. But it's just women's rights is a subset of individual rights, right? So, you know, it's like, oh, you're a feminist. Well, that's fine, but it's just a particular application of your liberal philosophy to the case of women. And your conclusion is women should be paid equally, treated equally, etc. And it looks like this. Certainly, or at least there's an even stronger argument for equal treatment between men and women in public systems, workplaces, education, you know, other things like that. So we can make companies pay men and women equally. If we have a really strong claim that women, we have evidence women are being paid less, which we do, but, you know, okay, we'll have to drag it up and go through it, but, you know, posit that the evidence is there and that it's pretty persuasive. Okay, well, so why not just make companies pay men and women more equally? We can do things like provide maternity leave and other support. So why not? We can spend equal money on men and women's sports, what we would call Title IX. You know, Title IX is very controversial. I totally get it. From a liberal philosophical point of view, it's a pretty strong argument, okay? And look, if you're sad about football programs closing, and I love football, don't get me wrong, you should know that Title IX is largely responsible for the American domination in women's Olympic sports. Women's swimming, all the women's sports that we just clean up with compared to the rest of the world it's not all, right? It's not all Title IX, but boy, an awful lot of it is. We have so many women pursuing athletics in college, and they just get really good at it. And we got a lot of, and it feeds down the system. More and more women do it. They raise their daughters to be athletic. I mean, women's soccer, gymnastics, volleyball, every sport that we're just bringing home, all, running, track and field, right? All of these. Why? Because we have prioritized equal treatment for women athletically in universities. And that actually does pay off in straight up gold medals. So, other reasons too. It's not just that, but that's a big one. And then, we can at least try to prevent private inequalities from becoming public ones, right? So give women the right to vote, right? If you agree that women should vote, you might be a liberal, right? And even a very basic liberal is just like, look, equal rights for everybody, right? And certainly we're not going to reach a society of perfect justice. Nobody expects that. So the Federalist has this great quote, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. But does this mean we can't try to do better than we currently are, right? Again, it's like a lot of objections that people first come up with when they start doing this stuff is very equivocal, really based upon trying to just muddy the waters and not really trying to sincerely have a argument, objection, response, counter response type method. Instead, it's just, oh, well, you can't do that. And it's just kind of like, that's what she's doing. What is it? Zing. I have a friend who goes, zing. He makes a good point. And then that's the end of it. Well, it's all over now. Oh, it's really, that's the end of it. So the Federalist has this great quote, if men were angels, no government would be necessary, right? We don't need to be angels. That's okay. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to do better than we currently are. And I mean, most people are making justice claims every day. So we need a way of systematizing and thinking through which of these justice claims are stronger, when, why, etc. People also, oh, it's going to cost too much, it's too hard, all of this. These are more just like, these are very common sort of equivocal objections, right? And a lot of the times they're based upon this assumption that doing what's right necessarily costs money, right? So people are like, oh, it's going to cost too much money, so we can't do it, we can't afford it, right? Well, just to be really clear, this is from The Economist. It's unclear that for example, environmental regulations, it's unclear that environmental regulations actually hurt the economy. The question, it seems to be, is do you have environmental regulations that are relatively easy to follow, not a big burden to business? They can still go about their lives relatively easily. They're just following an extra regulation. Or is following that regulation really hard? There's like a ton of paperwork. You have to hire a lawyer. You have to get everything pre-approved or whatever, and then it really adds a cost to your business. So this nice little Economist piece here, it's like, look, not all environmental regulations hurt your economy. Some of them do, some of them don't. That's a really important lesson. Same with questions of economic inequality. Oh, we're just giving money to the poor, that's going to be bad, blah, 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 or whatever. Well, truth be told, there's a lot of people right now, very important economists, who are worried that we're too top heavy and that we don't have enough demand for people buying and selling goods, and that is being a real drain on the overall economy. So to say something like we can't raise the minimum wage because it's going to kill jobs, things like that, the answer is sometimes yes and sometimes no. And we have to be very clear about when and where those answers are yes and no. Having better, or not better necessarily, but stronger workplace regulations, more overtime pay, an extra day off here or there, maternity leave, whatever kind of economic regulation that's going to sort of help the working and middle class, it is not the case that that's necessarily bad for business just all the time. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, just like the environmental question. I get in fights with people about this all the time because I'm like, you can't just say that. Doesn't mean that that's true. And then finally, we may have a personal obligation if we're looking at, a claim of justice. Maybe we should raise our own families differently. So maybe telling other people how to raise their kids using governmental power, maybe that's wrong. That makes me nervous, to be honest. Policemen in like every in every kitchen, beep, unequal treatment, beep. It's like, I don't know about that. But okay, maybe we should raise our own families differently. Maybe we need to speak up when we see injustice. Tell people who are say bullying behavior. Bullying behavior is pretty mean and it has some real negative consequences. Maybe we need to try to reason with the bullies, right? And some people will listen. Never always go one-on-one when you're trying to have a sincere conversation with somebody. Arguing with a group just doesn't really work that well. This is an example from a in-class activity. But for example, anti-bullying training, it actually works. If you do it right, it actually totally works. And why not? Let's have anti-bullying training in every workplace, school, college. It's not that crazy an idea. And some of these justice claims probably entail, yes, at times, curtailing your own self-interest. You know what I mean? Perhaps, doing some personal damage to your own reputation / pocketbook. If you're a religious person, if you believe in God of any kind, then you agree with this argument and you think that at least sometimes in important situations, you have to be willing to take the hit to your reputation and your pocketbook in order to do what's right, because your own eternal salvation or damnation depends on it, right? When you get up there, gates of heaven, Archangel Gabriel sitting there looking at you, he's going to see everything you did, right? So, at least sometimes this is probably true. Certainly not all the time. We don't need to be angels, okay? Like, that's also definitely not the case. But depending how you think about it, you also will get different sets of obligations to one another, right? If we're going to be liberals, we're going to have certain types of conclusions that are more likely to come out. If we're going to be civic Republicans, it's going to be a little bit different. So, for example, civic Republican view of the family is much more culturally based. In Athens, for example, families were really hard to their children. In Sparta, and Athens was much more like the United States today, very commercial, democratic, pretty equal between social classes and gender even and stuff like that. Sparta was the opposite, very hierarchical, caste system with aristocrats and non-aristocrats. Very mean to their children. But you know what? In Sparta, because they were a warrior culture, hardcore warrior culture, imagine everyone is just a samurai. Like everyone in your city. To be a citizen, you are a samurai. That's basically what Sparta was. And they treated their children in ways that I'm personally very uncomfortable with. They would, for example, keep their kids hungry, force them to steal food, but if they caught them stealing food, they would beat them. It's not how I'm going to raise my child. Let's just put it that way. And these similar types of conceptions then can also be used to judge national social systems. A liberal analysis here is that social systems that create more people with reason are better. A Republican analysis looks at an active citizenry. So it's not just about reason, it's about participating in your society and your community. That's again from a little bit earlier. But these distinctions really matter. And if you don't figure all these distinctions out, then you will have missed the boat. Okay, that's all I have for this lecture. This is an important lecture, so you might need to come back to it, right? It's a good hour and 30 minutes, but that's it. Enjoy the class.